All right, my clock says 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Atlantic Time, 12 p.m. Pacific. So I am going to begin the webinar, Supporting the U.S. Virgin Islands, Information and Resources for Crisis Counselors, presented by the Disaster Distress Helpline and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. My name is Christian Burgess, and I'm the director of the Disaster Distress Helpline, or the DDH. The DDH is a program of the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration administered by my parent company, the not-for-profit Mental Health Association of New York City, or MHA of NYC, or the website there that you see, MHA of NYC.org. SAMHSA began the Disaster Distress Helpline in 2012 to guarantee that everyone in the United States and its territories would have access to immediate crisis counseling and support throughout any phase of a natural or human-caused disaster. The DDH is a sub-network of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which means that the crisis centers that answer the calls and texts that come in to the DDH, those crisis centers are also part of the Lifeline. The Lifeline has over 160 centers in its network located throughout the country, and both the Lifeline and the Disaster Distress Helpline serve the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is why we're having this important webinar today. You can learn more about the Disaster Distress Helpline at disasterdistress.samhsa.gov. That's disasterdistress.samhsa.gov. And we'll also share information about the DDH at the end of the webinar. Before we get into the start of the webinar, I'm going to go over some logistics. The first and really most important logistic is to please mute your audio if you're calling in, just so that we don't pick up any background noise or any audio distortions that may interfere with the presentation. This webinar is being recorded so that we can use it as an archival resource for ongoing training and technical assistance for the crisis centers that comprise the Lifeline and DDH networks. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we are also providing closed captions for crisis counselors and others accessing the training who may be deaf, hard of hearing, or have other needs that might require the use of closed captions. Some other logistics that when we get to the discussion and Q&A at the end of the webinar, it's best that we use the chat pod on the right side of the screen. That way we don't have to worry about people talking over each other in the audio or interrupting one another or any other audio distortions. So please do use the chat pod for asking any questions or making comments, which you can do throughout the webinar. And I will, as a facilitator, I will be sure to go over the questions that you may post during the webinar at the end to make sure they see that, our presenters see that, and I'll draw their attention to that when we get to the discussion and Q&A. And also, please do use the chat function to introduce yourselves, your name, your title, the organization, where you're joining us from. And you can do that at any point during the webinar, and I'll type in a prompt there to get people to start introducing themselves here in a moment. And to draw your attention to a few supporting documents we have for the webinar, on the bottom right of your screen, you will see a file sharing pod. I do have a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides that we will be using today there that you can download. All you have to do is highlight it on your computer, and if you hover over it, it will give you the option, should give you the option to download and save to your computer, and you can open it from there. I also have to share a one-page summary of information about the Disaster Distress Helpline and the support that we provide to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Again, both of those documents are on the bottom right of the screen. And as I've already mentioned, we will make time for Q&A and discussion after our three guest presenters towards the end. But for now, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Anel Prim, who is joining us from the All Healers Mental Health Alliance. This webinar today would not be possible without Dr. Prim. Dr. Prim contacted me shortly after Hurricane Irma struck the U.S. Virgin Islands in September through SAMHSA in an interest to learn more about the support that we're providing to the U.S. Virgin Islands in the aftermath of the disasters, but also just so that we can collaborate in making sure that individuals and families in the U.S. Virgin Islands have the support they need, not just in the aftermath of these disasters, but year-round. Dr. Prim is a community psychiatrist based in Baltimore, Maryland, and serves as the chair and convener of the All Healers Mental Health Alliance. This national network of mental health professionals, health advocates, and faith community leaders facilitates culturally competent responses to the mental health needs of people affected by disasters. Since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the All Healers Mental Health Alliance has spawned leadership, advocacy, and collaborative action to assist communities confronting disasters such as Superstorm Sandy, the Flint, Michigan water and lead crisis, and Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Dr. Prim?
Thank you, Christian, and welcome everyone to the webinar supporting the U.S. Virgin Islands Information and Resources for Crisis Counselors. As Christian stated, the All Healers Mental Health Alliance is a national network of mental health professionals, health advocates, and faith community leaders who organize themselves to facilitate culturally competent responses to the mental health needs of those affected by disaster. I think today's program is an excellent example of the work that the All Healers Mental Health Alliance strives to do. After Hurricane Irma and Maria hit the U.S. Virgin Islands, we knew we needed to do something. Our temptation was to drop everything and run to the Virgin Islands, but that would not have been the appropriate thing to do. Instead, we looked for ways that we could facilitate and make possible actions that could assist our colleagues and friends in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we looked for different ways that we could make an impact. We were fortunate to connect with Christian Burgess, and I must give him many thanks, as well as his team at the Disaster Distress Hotline, certainly SAMHSA, and the presenters for today's program, Drs. Dudley Grant, Hamilton, and Paul Constantin. I would also like to recognize one of the All Healers Mental Health Alliance partners, Roland Riviere of the U.S. Virgin Islands Alliance, who has also assisted us in reaching out to the U.S. Virgin Islands for assistance in the aftermath of disaster. And last but not least, I'd like to thank former Congresswoman Dr. Donna Christensen of the U.S. Virgin Islands, who was also instrumental in the development of this webinar. So without further ado, again, I would like to thank you all for joining, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to share and recognizing that this is a wonderful example of how we can provide culturally competent information to the caregivers and crisis counselors and others who will work with the people of the Virgin Islands affected by disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Prim. And again, thank you for your role in bringing this webinar to fruition. So what we'll be talking about today, our agenda, is first we'll be providing an overview of the U.S. Virgin Islands, followed by a snapshot of common mental health concerns of individuals and families. Next, we'll talk about the impact of Hurricanes Irma and Maria on the U.S. Virgin Islands, and we'll conclude the presentation portion by sharing resources available to Lifeline and Disaster Distress Helpline crisis counselors in supporting callers and other crisis contacts from the USVI. And of course, we do have many folks in the room who are joining us outside of our Lifeline and DDH networks, and many of the crisis counselors in our network will be listening to this via the recording, but we do hope that the information and resources that we share will, of course, be useful to everyone joining us today, outside of the Lifeline and DDH networks as well. And again, as I mentioned, we will be concluding with some time for discussion and Q&A with our guest experts. If for any reason we run short on time or if we can't get to your question, rest assured I will be sharing our contact information at the end where you can follow up with additional questions and comments. So let me introduce our guest experts that we're very honored and pleased to have joining us today. First up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Dara Hamilton, who earned her PhD in clinical psychology from Howard University in 2002. Dr. Hamilton has lived and worked in a number of capacities and in a variety of environments, including Washington, D.C., Topeka, Kansas, Cincinnati, Ohio, and St. Croix, the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is her home. In addition to practicing as a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Hamilton is also an assistant professor at the University of the Virgin Islands. Following Dr. Hamilton, we'll be hearing from Dr. G. Rita Dudley-Grant, who is a native Virgin Islander. Dr. Dudley-Grant is a graduate of the Derner Institute at Adelphi in clinical psychology and the Harvard School of Public Health. She is a former Assistant Commissioner of Health in the U.S. Virgin Islands Department of Health, and Dr. Dudley-Grant has served as a founding member and current clinical director of Virgin Islands Behavioral Services, a comprehensive system of care located in the Virgin Islands, serving emotionally disturbed and behaviorally disordered children and adolescents from the territory and the Caribbean. And our final guest speaker today will be Dr. Vincentia Paul Constantin, who is the founder of Beautiful Dreamers, a not-for-profit organization where she works with families to meet their physical, educational, and psychological needs. Her other company, CW Educational and Behavioral Center, is a private practice which provides mental health services for individuals, groups, and families. With a specialization in trauma and crisis, Dr. Constantin has worked to ensure that populations impacted by trauma are adequately supported behaviorally and educationally. Dr. Constantin, I believe I've been mispronouncing it, apologies, works with school districts, community leaders, and families in meeting the specialized needs of both gifted and special education students in the United States, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Caribbean region. Dr. Constantin holds a bachelor's in psychology, master's in student personnel administration and mental health counseling, a master's in special education, and a PhD in educational leadership and policy. So, again, very pleased and honored to have our guest experts today. And we are going to now turn it over to Dr. Hamilton, who's going to provide an overview of the U.S. Virgin Islands history and culture. Dr. Hamilton?
Thank you, Christian, and good afternoon to everybody. I am very pleased to be here, and I am just feeling like this is such a benefit to the Virgin Islands that you all are interested and willing to participate in the training to learn more about our culture and about the impact of the hurricanes and to support the best and most competent treatment and intervention. So my section is an overview of the U.S. Virgin Islands history and culture. And the first thing is just establishing where we are located. Many people may not know where we're located, but we are located about 1,200 miles southeast of Florida, and we're east of Puerto Rico. Most can identify Florida, and most can identify Puerto Rico, but many people that I run into have a hard time locating us. So I want to just establish where we are in that respect. We are south of the British Virgin Islands, a bit east of Hispaniola, on which Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located, and east of Cuba and Jamaica, about 2,000 miles north of South America. Our capital is located on St. Thomas. There are 3 islands that most people hear about, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John. And then there's a little island, Water Island, that's right off the coast of St. Thomas that's now being recognized. The capital is on St. Thomas, and the capital's name is Charlotte Amalie. The largest of our islands is St. Croix, however, and then the smallest is St. John and then Water Island. Our density is about 776 persons per square mile, which gives us the issues of an urban area, meaning we have high density, but we also have those issues of a rural area because we are islands, and so we are separated by all this water, so we end up having experiences of both those places, both urban and rural experiences. The Virgin Islands is a very multicultural place. In fact, a little less than half of the residents are actually born in the Virgin Islands, and a little bit more than half are born outside of the Virgin Islands. So we are very heterogeneous. Most of those who are born outside the Virgin Islands are from Latin America and the Caribbean, followed by the United States. So we are truly a place that has a lot of diversity. About 77% of us identify as Black or African American, 15% white, and 6% other. The majority language is English. Most people speak English very well, or at least well. So if you're feeling a call, likely you will get a call from someone who is speaking English, but because we are so multicultural, it is also likely that you'll get a call from someone who speaks English well, but has also understands and speaks some sort of French patois from one of the islands down the chain, or also speaks Spanish either as a first or second language, or even speaks French. Immigrants from other islands include the island nations of Antigua, Barbuda, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Nevis, and the Dominican Republic. So what that means is we're very, very multicultural, and you'll find that you will meet people from many different places but still consider themselves Virgin Islanders. A little bit of the history. The islands were discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1493, but we've had an interesting history of having had 7 flags flying over us. After the Spanish, there were the Dutch and the English on one half of the island, and then the French. For a brief time, we were ruled by the Knights of Malta, which was a religious group, and then Denmark, and then finally the United States, when we were transferred from Denmark to the United States in 1917. In 2017, we celebrated that centennial, the 100-year anniversary of being transferred to the United States. We were acquired for a strategic location, our location here in the Caribbean. The history and the legacy of slavery is responsible for both the large concentration of people of African descent, but it's also a part of the reason why our culture has been developed in the way that it has. That and the fact that we've been under those 7 flags. So each one of those flags has contributed a bit to the culture in terms of the food, in terms of the language that we use, the accents that we have, the dress, the music, the dance, the customs, and so forth are all influenced by each one of those flags. We understand that less than half of the people are born in the Virgin Islands, and more than 1/3 are born in Latin America or the Caribbean islands, and about 16% born on the United States mainland. I'm going to use myself as an example of a typical Virgin Islander, perhaps. I wasn't born in St. Croix. However, I've been here since I was 3 months of age, barring school. My parents are from the States, but I have a sister who was born on St. Croix and one who was born on St. Thomas. So, we come from all over. You may have people who are born here, but then they move back to St. Lucia, or born in St. Lucia and then move here, or born in Dominica and then move here to the Virgin Islands. So we're very interesting and multicultural, pluralistic society. People native to St. Croix are called Crucian, St. Thomas, St. Thomian, and sometimes we refer to people from St. John as St. Jonian, but typically it's people from St. John. And the accents may be referred to in similar ways. So people from St. Croix, they may have a Crucian accent, speaking English but with a Crucian accent, or speaking English with a St. Thomian accent. And so there are very various forms of English patois that are spoken. And if people are speaking really quickly, it can almost sound like you're speaking another language, but in fact it's English with either a heavy Crucian accent or a heavy St. Thomian accent, or maybe an accent that's influenced by someone coming from down island. The culture. People here are friendly, they're warm, they're welcoming, and they're cautious at the same time. You know, it is kind of typical of communities that are a little bit closed off from the rest of the world to become a little bit cautious about outsiders, but the people in general are very, very friendly and open, fun, humorous. Politeness is very, very important. One of the things that's very important here is making and returning greetings. So people will likely say good afternoon, or they'll say good morning, or they'll say good night when they address you, and it's considered to be rude not to return that greeting. So if you hear that, then you'd want to return that greeting. Or you may want to start with that greeting if you're the one initiating an interaction. We do have some social problems that are, related to higher incidences of poverty here. We do have higher violent crime, especially murder rates in the Virgin Islands, and those are concerning. We are, though, a population that is very competent. About 37% of us have some college, and so that, we're a very competent population. So sometimes I think from the outside it can look like if people have a heavy accent or they are from somewhere far away, they may lack competence, but we are quite a competent people. Important holidays and festivities are things like the agriculture fair, and I'll just say in the purposes of the hurricane, in that context, that was actually, we were not able to do that fair, and it's been moved to May. But every year we have an agriculture fair. We have a Christmas festival and carnival. This is a community that is pretty religious, and so we celebrate things like Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Monday. So that is typically, those are typically holidays that are celebrated here because of the religious, the religious bent. Thanksgiving. We also celebrate other cultural holidays, Virgin Islands Puerto Rico Friendship Day, Dominican Independence Day, and those are testaments to just how multicultural our society is. A little bit more about the culture. Our foods are often heavy and carb-based. They're very interesting. They're very delicious. They're very flavorful. And there may be ones that you haven't heard of, so I did note some of them there. Things like saltfish and dumpling or kalaloo, heavy stews like stewed goat, stewed beef, chicken, and so forth. The most practiced religion is Christianity. We listen to a variety of musics, calypso, soca, reggae, kwelbe, and a lot of American music varieties. You do hear a lot of country music as well. One of the things in terms of treatment has to do with their reliance on cultural remedies. People use a lot of teas. They use foods. They use what we call bush, which is basically teas, in order to treat ailments. And so that's something to look out for. You may find that people may use spiritual explanations for mental health symptoms, interpreting in psychotic symptoms as being visions or as being demons or spirits, and sometimes you have people seeking religious care for those types of symptoms because of that fact. And in terms of medications, it's the same sort of thing. They may forego typical medications or modern medicine for bush tea and other teas and bushes that have medicinal property. Some important or famous Virgin Islanders that you may hear about are our current political leaders, who our current governor is Honorable Kenneth Mapp. This is an election year, so November is an election year for us. Lieutenant Governor Honorable Osbert Potter, and our delegate to Congress, Stacey Plaskett, and our previous delegate, whom Dr. Prim mentioned, Donna Christensen. We have some radio hosts that are very popular and they keep people informed. And these are Mario Moorhead, so people may refer to them. Holland Redfield on St. Croix also, and Addie Otley on St. Thomas. And a lot of the information goes through the radios. A lot of processing of the political climate, of the hurricane, of anything that's happening in the islands goes through these radio hosts and these talk shows. There's a list of famous Virgin Islanders there, just to give you an example of some people who have been more widely recognized. And I'm going to just end on a little discussion on our strengths. People from the Virgin Islands are very resilient, very friendly and competent. We are very community-minded. One of the things that really helped after the hurricanes was that people helped their neighbors. They came out, they cleared the streets, and they helped people with their homes. They helped put up boards and shutters and so forth ahead of and after the hurricanes. So really relying on that social network has been one of the things that has contributed to our resilience during this time. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude my section here and move on to the next section. Thank you. Dr. Grant.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. That was very comprehensive and right on point. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation has to do with the incidence and prevalence of depression, substance abuse, suicide, and major mental illness in the Virgin Islands. And I will start with the caveat that epidemiology and health statistics is very difficult to obtain at this point in the Virgin Islands, in part because of a lack of resources and the ability to communicate effectively, to gather data, to keep the data. And so that is something that we are very much trying to work on. However, information obtained from Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta suggested that our territory, which, as Dr. Hamilton indicated, is a small 3/4 islands, 103,000 in the population. So similar numbers to smaller states, Maine, New Hampshire, etc. So our rates of depression being probably the highest form of mental illness and emotional disturbance in the territory, both within the adult and the juvenile population, tends to run about at a emotionally disturbed level. We would go with, let's say, 20 to 30%. Major mental illness is about 8 to 10%. So if you're looking at 100,000 population, you're looking about 8 to 10,000 individuals. And just to give you a sense of that, what we're talking about in the way of resources, we only have about 700 people being served within the Division of Mental Health. So I have spoken with the director, Dr. Wallace Berube, Ms. Wallace Berube, director, and she indicates that similar to statistics that were gathered back in 2009, they are now serving about 700 persons. And of those, in 2009, 264 were seen in St. Thomas, St. John, and 403 were seen in St. Croix. The breakdown is about 51% female, 49% male, which is a reflection of the population, which is about that same size split. 71% non-Hispanic and 17% Hispanic. And it's important to note that there is a difference in the level of Hispanic, non-Hispanic, whereas in St. Croix, where the methadone clinic is located, you have a higher percentage of the Hispanic population. About a third of the population is from the Dominican Republic and the Puerto Rico and the other surrounding Latina islands, and we do have a much higher incidence of methadone use and substance abuse in those populations, particularly heroin. In St. Thomas, it's a smaller percentage of Hispanics and consequent smaller percentage of those particular issues. The highest substance abuse issue in the territory is the use of marijuana, and you do find that particularly high in the adolescent population. And the other issue of great concern is the crack cocaine, crack in particular, and you do find that more prevalent in the younger populations as well. Prevention services do tend to target the youth, and again, through government work, accessed about 800 youth, and schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depression are the most frequent diagnoses seen in the mental health clinics. The suicide data for the U.S. Virgin Islands, again, was not available, but in 2000, currently, in 2009, suicide rates per 100,000 in the population shows that suicide tends to occur in the older age group. This is the system that we have in the Virgin Islands. As you can see on the slide, we have health, alcoholism, and drug dependency services, which are located in the community clinics. This particular slide is coming from what is known as our 5-year plan, which stemmed from a 17-year process because of work that was done through the disability rights of the Virgin Islands, which brought a consent decree through the court to try and enforce the need for expanded services. The 5-year plan was to go from 2014 to 2019. So far, we have a plan, but I remain hopeful that with the assistance now, out of every bad comes a good, and with the intense focus now on mental health service needs in the territory, we here in the territory are really hopeful that some of the priority areas will begin to be implemented with additional resources that are coming into the territory. I would have you look at this compendium of services, which includes Virgin Islands Mental Health Planning Advisory Council, which has now been replaced by the latest iteration is the Mental Health Coalition. Other government agencies, I will let you know that Human Services is the primary provider of mental health services to children and adolescents, and the largest provider is the organization that I'm the clinical director of, and that is Virgin Islands Behavioral Services. The Department of Education provides the primary services to the educationally, academically compromised, and they probably are the first point of contact for children and their families. The Department of Justice, of course, would be dealing with those that are coming through the juvenile system, as well as adult services. And unfortunately, as does happen in many areas in the United States, because of the lack of resources that we have here, the jail and the juvenile jail tend to be the largest providers or for residential, if you would call it that, holding cells for major mental illness. There are also community-based not-for-profit as well as for-profit entities such as Island Therapy, such as the Women's Coalition, such as other agencies, Queen Louise Home, Frederiksted Health Center, that are all providing mental health support services. There are, of course, private providers. I would let you know that right now, Juan Luis Hospital has been severely compromised. It was compromised in terms of mental health services before the storm, and since the storm, there are actually about 2 beds, and the Juan Luis Hospital is the hospital on St. Croix. So there are about 2 beds that are very crisis beds. The longest stay that anyone can come in is about 5 days, and it's usually within 24 to 48 hours that a person is discharged. So we are in desperate need of longer stay services for adults in the St. Croix. In St. Thomas, there are more beds. There is the Elja Schultebrand facility, which does provide longer term services, 32 beds, and the 8 to 12 bed unit at the Governor Roy Lester Schneider Hospital on St. Thomas. As I just said, the two acute care hospitals, you have Roy Lester Schneider and Wong Louis Hospital. The Division of Mental Health, Alcoholism, and Drug Dependency Services provides psychiatric evaluations, medication management, outpatient therapy, individual counseling, substance use, the methadone clinic on St. Croix, not on St. Thomas. And unfortunately, most of the adult services for longer term stay especially from St. Croix, but within the territory, are going off island. So there's a significant problem in terms of, as we know, the care that is most evidence-based, which is in the community and in the home. So these patients are being sent off island, and it has been a practice for a long time. Various kinds of interventions have been proposed, and people have been brought back, such as the creation of the Elja Schultebrand, but funding always continues to be a challenge. Children's mental health services, as I said, are primarily provided through the Department of Human Services. Not-for-profit agencies include Queen Louise Home, which is, using the old-fashioned term, it is an orphanage. It does provide services for children from the ages of 1, 2 through 12. There's the Women's Coalition. They provide services for battered women and for families and for children coming out of battering homes. The Family Resource Center is the same type of program on St. Thomas. My brother's workshop is it's relatively new and very effective because it does take high school dropouts on both islands, and it has them focused on trade and building a trade and completing their high school education. And so they are having a lot of success. I mentioned island therapy, Insight Psychological, other providers, independent providers are available on both islands. Residential children's services, there's Seaview Adolescent Mental Health Services on St. Thomas, 14 beds, Virgin Islands Behavioral Services with 30 beds, and unfortunately there are still off-island placements happening as well. We were founded in 1995.
Dr. Dudley Grant?
Yes.
Dr. Dudley Grant, I'm sorry. This is Christian. I just wanted to give you the 5-minute heads up.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Yep.
So basically, some of the statistics, we serve 59 outpatients on St. Thomas and St. Croix. And I am very, very proud to say that while we have had some significant suicide attempts, since 1995, we've never had a completed suicide within Virgin Islands Behavioral Services. The Department of Human Services also runs the Youth Rehabilitation Center, which are the programs for troubled youth. And I've already mentioned the DOJ, and then the VI Department of Public Safety. And we talked about those services, and basically what we're needing is more integrated care. And I do want to get to the last slide, which came out of the mental health 5-year plan. And this is where we really need to coordinate our services. And while we continue to build and expand, if we don't really focus on integrating, on sharing information, on having all of us working together, then all of the services that we try and throw at the problems will not really meet the needs So we are hopeful here that going forward, there will be a much more integrated and coordinated and effective approach to expanding the needed services as well as to expanding the ability to do the needs assessment so that we are working from hard data. And with that, I thank you very much, and I will turn it on to Dr. Paul Constantine.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you for the opportunity to present the Virgin Islands to you. I want to thank my co-presenters for the informative information. My part this afternoon is on the impact of Hurricanes Irma and Maria as it pertains to property damage, rebuilding, and of course ongoing concerns and challenges that we're still having in the Virgin Islands. Based on the pictures on my first slide, we can all agree that the Virgin Islands is absolutely a beautiful place, and of course unbiased. And it still remains a beautiful place today, even after the 2 Cat 5 hurricanes that we've had. So on September 6th of last year, 2017, we experienced Hurricane Irma on St. Thomas, St. John, with the most destruction, and of course in some on St. Croix. About 2 weeks later, on September 20th, we experienced Hurricane Maria, primarily on St. Croix, with substantial damage to the west end of the island and flood concerns on St. Thomas and, of course, on St. John. As a result of these hurricanes, we sustained major damages in terms of infrastructure, homes, businesses, dwellings, and as my presenters have mentioned, destruction to both hospitals, one in St. Croix and one in St. Thomas. As a result of that, we have ongoing concerns, major concerns, as it pertains to the structure of homes and buildings. We're still having issues with partial roofs, mold and mildew homes in businesses. And the issue here is we do not have businesses to really provide services of mold removal from these infrastructures, which makes the conditions worse in terms of ongoing problems on medical and also on individuals who are simply unable to move from their current dwellings because, of course, we don't have access to ongoing homes. And once again, we're in the place of not having enough transitional homes at this time. Immediately following the hurricanes, we had overcrowding in our shelters. To date, there are no shelters available to the public. However, there is one shelter on St. Thomas that is available to first responders, and that is really our firefighters, EMT, and police officers. The health risk here we have really in our vulnerable populations, and that's because some of our populations are isolated. These individuals may have mobility issues. They may have issues regarding access to medical resources, and as a result, I am really looking forward to the case management service that I will be talking about later in my presentation to help in identifying these pockets of individuals who will need that specialized attention in receiving support. Following the hurricane, we had a mass exodus of individuals who are chronically and or mentally ill. These individuals were flown to Puerto Rico, Louisiana, Florida, and Atlanta. Because of the limited capacities in our hospitals, we continue to house evacuees, primarily in Atlanta, To date, we have approximately 257 evacuees here, and they are housed at 3 separate Sonesta hotels. In Atlanta, the expectation is that these individuals will return to the Virgin Islands next month on the 15th. Of course, we have the ongoing concerns in terms of what resources do we have in place currently to support these individuals as they return. As it pertains to school updates, there are approximately 10,000 students registered in the St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix districts. Of course, this number has been impacted as a result of the hurricane. We have students leaving to attend schools on the mainland because of our current infrastructure. We are now on split sessions, and what that means is there are 2 sessions happening for our students. First session begins approximately 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., with the second session following at 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., and as one would assume, this places more stress on families who are now having to find different support systems in terms of where to place their children before or after these sessions. To date, there is still about 40% of our buildings still considered condemned and or unsafe as it pertains to schools for our children and school personnel. As it relates to accommodations, for those of you who are in the place of having to find hotels, I'm quite sure you would agree that we have limited space capacity at most of our hotels. In fact, the major hotels are yet to reopen. Most should be open by this time next year. We rely heavily on tourism, and because our hotels are not to capacity functioning, of course, our economy has suffered greatly. Even in terms of rental cars, it's becoming a challenge to find transportation on the island. As one can imagine, we have some immediate responses as it pertains to unemployment because of the hurricanes. This data was collected March of this year to reflect 35.9% of our Virgin Islanders are now unemployed or underemployed. In November and December, it was 35.3%, and January, 38.4%. There's a group of individuals, a population, the undocumented workers, who, of course, we do not have statistics on that population as it pertains to employment rates. The status of rebuilding in the Virgin Islands is very, very slow. It's right now, as it pertains to electricity, most homes who are qualified to receive electricity at 100% capacity. We still experience electricity outages throughout the island. Most homes do have some phone and internet service. The rebuilding is slow, and that's because the Virgin Islands are dependent on materials coming in to help with the rebuilding process. To help with the hospitals and schools, we are expecting to build modular hospitals and classrooms. To date, we do not have a specified time as to when that will be implemented. My hope is that it will be later this year. Mental health concerns, of course, has been something that has been ongoing throughout the Virgin Islands, and with the hurricanes, it has simply made the situation worse as it pertains to stress, anxiety, feelings of despair, hopelessness. We're seeing more individuals seeking help for these particular types of conditions. Students, educational personnel, first responders are also those asking for support, emotional and or behavioral support. There are private practices and or community organizations available to support, but we are limited, we're tired in the work, and we need more help as it pertains to mental health support throughout the Virgin Islands. I am so grateful for SAMHSA in what they've done to provide some community-based behavioral health services to the community. I am a provider on St. Thomas. There is also a provider, Island Therapy, on St. Croix, and since November of last year, we've been providing the community with crisis counseling. When I created this slide, we were at the capacity of 9,000 survivors who benefited from our services. To date, we're close to 10,000 survivors who have directly been impacted by the services we provide. And what that looks like, we started out in the DRC centers in the Virgin Islands, and we have now going through the communities, going through different community-based organizations, as well as providing in-home services. On St. Thomas in particular, we're targeting our attention in the housing communities. There is one housing community in particular that we're very concerned about. Residents have been asked to leave the premises because, of course, the infrastructure has been severely compromised. Unfortunately, there isn't housing available in our community, so they've been given the option to leave the Virgin Islands and seek shelter elsewhere on the mainland. Because of that, the calls are coming in for stress and anxiety support. Crisis counseling will continue until November of this year. It is my hope that our case management services will begin in June of this year. The case management services will allow us the opportunity to directly service those who are having mobility issues and or different mental health and or medical concerns, and providing adequate services to these populations. As we know, January 1st marks our hurricane season, and we are very much concerned about what that means for us in the Virgin Islands. There are a lot of different organizations on ground to provide some support for the community, and we are to expect that long-term recovery will take a while in the Virgin Islands, especially in the areas of health, mental health, housing, and medical assistance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Constantine. And as I move towards the discussion and Q&A, I just posted a message in the chat pod for those of you joining us for the live webinar to please ready any questions or comments you may have and post them there for any of our guest presenters. And I will also be moving forward to the for more information slide in a couple of moments here for the benefit of those in the room for the webinar, as well as for those of you watching the recording, so that you have contact information for any follow-up questions that you may have. And I have a couple of questions for our presenters to get started that I'll ask here over the audio. And presenters, just when you're ready to answer, if you could just unmute. And my first question is going back to Dr. Hamilton. I'm wondering if, in terms of the way that the islands are spread out with St. Thomas, St. Croix, is there a lot of mobility between those islands? Do residents typically tend to go back and forth either for living or working, to access services? And how is that typically done? Is there a ferry system, or is it some other means of transport between the islands?
Okay, so thank you, Christian, for the question. Residents can move between islands. However, it is difficult to move between St. Croix and St. Thomas. It's more expensive to move between St. Croix and St. Thomas. There is a ferry. The ferry is unreliable because of weather. You know, if the seas are high, then it's not able to move, or if the weather is poor, like it's raining, then it's not able to go, and so that can prohibit it. But it's cheaper than going by seaplane. So the other option between St. Croix and St. Thomas, because there's about 40 miles between those two, is to go via seaplane, and that's about $200 round trip. So it's a bit more costly to try to move that way. The ferry is slow and may be unpredictable. Between St. Thomas and St. John, there will be a ferry as well. And some people actually do even work in the British Virgin Islands, or live in the British Virgin Islands and work in St. Thomas, or vice versa, you know. So the ferry would be the way to get around, but the cost can be prohibitive depending on where you're located.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I would imagine that was a factor, of course, following the hurricanes.
It was, and it was a factor in terms of trying to provide support, because when Irma happened and hit St. Thomas, St. Croix mobilized and tried to send resources over, but it was by boat. How are we going to get these things over? By boat, and that can be expensive, especially with the cost of fuel. So it is hard to move around.
Yeah.
And
thank you.
And last thing about that,
Yep.
It does also affect our ability to get services on different islands, because if we need to see a doctor, for example, we have one neurologist. He's on St. Thomas. I believe we only have one right now. And so you'd have to fly over, or he may see appointments on St. Croix on Saturdays, one Saturday a month, something like that. So being isolated, being islands here, even isolated amongst each other, or being that far from the United States mainland does affect our ability to receive care.
Great, thank you. And a question for Dr. Dudley Grant. You had mentioned in your presentation that for various services and placements, and Dr. Hamilton just touched on this as well, that many residents end up going, quote-unquote, off-island. Does that typically mean to the mainland U.S. or to even other countries for various services?
That's a very good question. Typically, if the government is sending people off island for mental health services or for any other kind of health services, it tends to be to the U.S. mainland. Frequent locations are Florida, of course, because of proximity, Atlanta. There's a large population there. The places where you would have other Virgin Islanders and or specialty clinics. Conversely, persons that are taking themselves off island tend to go where they have families. So people, let's say from a frequent place that people would go is even to Guadeloupe or to the 3A islands. They might even go to France or the Dutch locations, depending on what their own comfort level is with the familiarity of the services. But I would say by and large, I would guesstimate 80 to 90% of people would tend to go to the United States because it is most cost effective, and Florida, of course, is the easiest to access.
Mm-hmm. And is there assistance for when people need to do that in terms of covering transportation costs or any of the other associated costs with having to travel for such types of care? It is very difficult, and there
tends not to be. Usually, if a person, of course, as always happens, has other resources, whether, let's say they have medical air service insurance or other kinds of insurance, if it's very, very necessary, like for instance, right now, the Department of Health, Division of Mental Health, has just released 2 requests for proposals to provide services for 20 clients each, one in forensic community and one in forensic facility and one into a transitional care. And in that instance, they have 20 of their own clients that they would then be sending through a contract with a hospital in the States or a forensic mental health treatment facility in the States. But for the most part, you would have actually people having to use their own resources, which makes it tremendously difficult to deal with acute care. Crisis care is truly, it is hair-raising to deal with it because of the lack of resources that are immediately available.
Yes, yes, thank you. And all the more reason why all the information you all are sharing is so important, including for us in the webinar and those listening in the recording as advocates in our communities and in institutions and organizations to strengthen the system of care available to our fellow Americans in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the interest of time, I'm going to just review some resources very quickly here. The slide that's on the screen now is just more information about the Disaster Distress Helpline and National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, both of which provide 24/7 toll-free hotline support to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and you can get our hotline information on our websites. And also sharing a few resources from our guest presenters, the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations, Beautiful Dreamers, and CW Educational and Behavioral Center. There are many other resources, although not enough, as we've heard, for the people of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And one I do want to mention that we often use with the Disaster Distress Helpline is the SAMHSA Treatment Referral Locator, which is online at findtreatment.samhsa.gov. That's findtreatment.samhsa.gov. If you type in the zip codes of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which could be 00801 or for St. Thomas, or there are other zip codes for any of the islands that you would get from a crisis contact, you can key that into SAMHSA's Treatment Referral Locator, and you will find services located throughout the islands. And the Treatment Referral Locator is also available via hotline at 1-800-662-HELP or 1-800-662-4357. So that's just one example of a key resource that we often use with the Disaster Distress Helpline in providing support to the people in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We've also been sharing a website with callers from the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is informusvi.com, which I believe was a website set up in the aftermath of the hurricanes. It might have been existing before, but that provides a clearinghouse of resources and information and updates about rebuilding efforts and other services available to people impacted by the hurricanes. Again, that's informusvi.com. I want to conclude our presentation with my contact information and our email addresses of our guest presenters, because we are running out of time here. And if you didn't if you weren't able to post a question or comment, I see a couple of comments coming in there in the chat box. Please do reach out and connect with our guest presenters, or you can reach out to me and I'll link you with our guest presenters. And I just want to thank Dr. Dara Hamilton, Dr. G. Rita Dudley Grant, and Dr. Vicentia Paul Constantine for their time and their information and resources today. It's very valuable. We'll have many of our crisis counselors listening to this recording at a later date as a part of our ongoing training and technical assistance and support to the U.S. Virgin Islands. It will be a long recovery, but again, I'm just so thankful for all of the information and support, as well as to, again, Dr. Anil Prim from the All Healers Mental Health Alliance for making this webinar possible. So with that, I will be concluding the presentation. I will leave the screen up, the room up for a few more minutes to give folks a chance to write down any of the contact information that they may want to do. And just with that, again, thank you, everyone. And thank you, again, Dr. Hamilton, Dudley Grant, and Paul Constantine for your time and work today in supporting the U.S. Virgin Islands. Thank you, everyone.